So how do you stop your glorious charge being torn apart in a flurry of small arms fire? Let's talk Overwatch in 9th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today we're talking about the Overwatch Mechanic, the last desperate burst of gunfire that squads try to put out to repel troops that are trying to charge them and hopefully not get torn apart by a whole bunch of chainswords or power weapons. I must admit, as game mechanics go in 40k, I think it's a fairly punchy and evocative one. It always feels a bit disappointing if your opponent's trying to charge a whole load of really powerful guns and they can't make any effort whatsoever to try and repel them from combat, though I think they've perhaps got the balance a bit better in 9th edition than 8th. In the video we'll talk about the mechanic of Overwatch and how it works, then talk about some of the best units to use it with and when you might want to, and then if you are one of the charging units, let's talk about how to avoid Overwatch and hopefully make sure that your shock troops don't meet an untimely end. So the idea of Overwatch has been part of 40k for really quite a long time now. I believe 6th edition might be the time it first emerged in recent times, and it's been part of the game since. In 8th edition in particular, it was really quite an important mechanic. Basically everyone could Overwatch every time they were charged. You roll your normal shooting attacks, but you only ever hit them on an unmodified 6 to hit. It was really quite a powerful boost to shooting armies, and I think perhaps one of the things that made melee a little bit less viable in 8th than it is in 9th. And I must admit, rolling a whole ton of Overwatch was something that I felt slowed down the game a bit. As it was basically free shooting, it made sense to do it every single time, though only hitting on 6s often means that you are rolling a whole ton of dice, often for little or no result whatsoever. In power though, it could range from a small bit of chip damage to some strong units, or make some units just completely unchargeable for lightly armoured troops. You had the potential for one powerful Overwatch unit to be shooting dead multiple units trying to charge it in a single turn. In 9th edition, I must admit I do like the way that they've implemented Overwatch a bit better. Rather than being a passive always-on ability, it's now a stratagem that you have to pay a command point for. That means that usually it's only going to be done once per phase per army, so you have to pick and choose which are going to be the best units to Overwatch with. It's going to cost you some resources, so the option to use that command point on things later, and even when you do select that unit, unless it's got other special rules, it won't be firing Overwatch multiple times per turn, so you don't have a situation where one threatening unit could kill lots and lots of units trying to charge it. Making Overwatch a lot less powerful though has meant that a lot of Overwatch boosting rules just aren't really all that good. Certain armies and chapter tactics that had a boost to it just really aren't that useful in 9th edition, things like the Mordian Iron Guard for Astra Militarum, who could really do with a rules rewrite. As well as this stratagem though, some other special rules can allow you to fire Overwatch, though I must admit, as the codexes have rolled out, it really seems that Games Workshop aren't being particularly forthcoming with this ability. Unless you play in Tau, it's pretty rare for any army to get Overwatch from anything else besides this stratagem. Though Tau themselves have Overwatch improved in multiple different ways, they get it throughout the army for free. They have a 5+ version of Overwatch for their Tau Sept units if you choose to play them rather than Farsight Enclaves, and they have their supporting fire from nearby units with other units covering each other to repel the enemy. Useful as it is, and far better than anyone else's Overwatch, it still doesn't really seem to have been working out for them so well in 9th. They've still been kind of bottom of the pack power level wise, though of course that's probably going to change when their new codex drops. Still though, despite Overwatch being toned down quite so much in 9th, it can still be very relevant and very dangerous for certain units. It's definitely got the potential to change games. So when might be a good idea to choose to Overwatch then? First up, there's just quite a lot of units that are just mathematically better at overwatching compared with others. Perhaps the single biggest factor though is that you generally want to use it on your biggest, most powerful units and not the small, weak, puny ones. If you're spending that same command point to Overwatch, it's generally going to be far more worth it to do it on something big and threatening, where they might have enough shots or enough really powerful shots to actually do something good, rather than just chipping a tiny bit of damage if you're lucky. Perhaps super heavy vehicles might be one of the best examples of this, things like a Knight Castellan that's covered in guns, or any gunline units where you've invested a few hundred points in their firing. Often when Overwatch is discussed, I find that people often like to say that if you've got loads of shots coming in, you're likely to get a few more 6s, though honestly I think that that's maybe a bit more psychology at play. I think that firing Overwatch could be just as valuable with a few really powerful shots, and if you get lucky and get a hit or two, then it could make a big difference to how much damage you get. Sure, if you're firing loads and loads of shots at the target, you're a bit more likely to get some reliable damage out of the unit, but to be honest with Overwatch you might well just be hoping for an excessive amount of damage, and a small chance of a few really big hits getting through could well be better than a bit of chip damage. As well as just really big units though, there's all sorts of units that are a bit better at firing Overwatch mathematically. Of course, anything that auto hits, things like mass flamers within a unit, or the Death Guard Foul Blightspawn, they're all just essentially going to be getting a normal shooting phase at the enemy before they charge in, so that's going to be far more valuable on average for your command points. Any unit that's got inbuilt 4B rolls to hit, say for example if you've used the Chapter Master buff on a unit of Space Marine Devastators, they're going to be a fair bit more likely to get those 6s to Overwatch if you can reroll anything but. It'll get you fairly close to getting 1 out of 3 of your shots through rather than 1/6. Just from the way the maths works out, usually Overwatch is going to be better on low ballistic skill units compared with high ballistic skill units. For example, if a Space Marine unit fires Overwatch, you're getting 1 out of every 4 hits that you'd normally be getting on the targets. With Orcs, as they only hit on 5s and 6s anyway, you'd be getting 1 out of every 2 hits you'd normally get. Basically, bad ballistic skill Orc units are essentially getting half of their normal damage output from Overwatch, which is far better than most armies. Any mechanics that give you extra hits on 6s, like exploding 6s to hit, say for example the Necron Immortals with the Tesla carbines, they get 2 extra hits on every hit roll of a 6, whether that's in normal shooting or Overwatch. It means that those 6s that you do get with Overwatch are going to be super valuable. The same works for anything else with a similar buff, say for example the Armored Moiraxes with the Lightning Locks. And finally, units with any special rules that boost their Overwatch innately, for example the Necron Hexmark Destroyer. That one gets to hit on 2s in Overwatch, so you're basically getting your same damage output again as you would in the shooting phase. I guess it's not too bad damage output, but again that one's a fairly cheap character without amazing damage output to start with. At least the hits you do get are quite reliable though. The ultimate units where you're going to want to think about Overwatch are things that combine multiples of these. Say for example the Imperial Knight Valiant, with that massive conflagration cannon it has. That's both a super heavy vehicle, and also one that auto hits, so Overwatch is rarely going to be more valuable than that. Of course though, just having raw damage output alone doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be worth it to Overwatch. Even if you do manage to strip a few wounds from an enemy unit, it might not necessarily be your best use of your command points, or it might even have been better spent on a lesser damage output unit somewhere across the board. Overwatch is going to be super valuable against any fragile and hard-hitting infantry, say for example things like Drakari Witches or Sisters Repentia. Relatively expensive infantry models for their defensive profile. Every one that you kill will likely prevent a fair amount of damage coming at you in the subsequent fight phase, and a little bit of Overwatch can go a long way, even from a basic squad with small arms fire. In particular, if your opponents try to charge you with any really tiny units that you actually have a chance to kill outright, that's also going to be super valuable. Preventing a nuisance charge like your vehicle being locked up, or the enemy contesting an important objective. I had one situation where my Vindicator tank was charged by a lone aggressor sometime in early 9th. Rolling Overwatch on that allowed me to kill the aggressor, stopping the Vindicator from being locked up, and stopping the other player from taking the objective. I know that even with a fair amount of high power shots, it was still very lucky to actually take out the aggressor with the shooting, but I'd see it as a small chance of achieving something really meaningful, and that was a big swing in the game. Another really good time where it might be even more valuable to fire Overwatch is when the damage might be able to change the fate of a combat and mean that you come out on top rather than your opponent. Say for example, if you had a Nemesis Dread Knight with a couple of big guns, that was charged by a squad that had a decent chance of killing it. If you think that the damage output from the Overwatch could be enough to allow your Dread Knight to survive until it gets to strike, it could be a ridiculously good investment of a command point. First you actually get the actual damage of the Overwatch on the unit, then you get the melee damage of your model that was just about to die and you saved it from dying, and then in your own turn you might be free to fall back with that unit, or just remain in combat and keep on shooting, whatever makes more sense. Obviously certain combats are going to be fairly well balanced between yourself and your opponent anyway, and a bit of luck on one side or the other could swing it more than a bit of Overwatch, but if it ever does make the difference, it could be a really big one. The damage that you cause for your opponent could be either by depleting their squads so they have less models to swing with, or maybe if they've got a vehicle that's really close to being bracketed, if you could just chip off that one extra wound with a bit of Overwatch, then they won't be hitting you quite as hard if your profile degrades. Finally, and one thing that a couple of people brought up in a recent video about getting your own models killed, sometimes it could make sense to deliberately try and Overwatch to fire a plasma gun or something with the sole purpose of getting your model killed to make the enemy's charge longer or undoable. I have actually done that myself once before. It was an Imperial Guard Rough Rider with a plasma gun back when they were a thing in 8th. I fired the Overwatch deliberately overcharging to try and get my own model killed, then the opponent wasn't able to make the charge and wasn't able to get onto the objective that they wanted to, which they would have easily been able to do if they'd been able to make that roll. It definitely felt pretty satisfying at the time. It's not very often in 40k where it would be better for your units to just simply melt away rather than existing anymore. So I think there are a fair few occasions when Overwatch can make a big difference, but fortunately for the assault troops trying to make it to the gun line, there really are quite a lot of ways of playing around it and making sure that you aren't just losing big squads wholesale to mass enemy Overwatch fire. First up, and perhaps the worst case scenario, is that if you're really going to lose all that many of your troops to Overwatch and you're not going to gain all that much, then probably just not charging in the first place is the best idea. Even if it is the difference between leaving your melee unit just sat right next to an enemy gunline unit, at least them having to kill you in their own turn is better than almost certainly losing it in Overwatch, as that might well be the case with certain massive flamer type Overwatches, say if you've got a fragile squad trying to charge a whole load of Salamander's aggressors or something. If there's no way of getting around that Overwatch, then maybe just try not to deal with them in the charge phase in the first place. The things where the Overwatch is too high, you might well just be able to shoot to death, so say if you focus down the unit with the great Overwatch and then charge something that didn't have that, or even just use a little bit of shooting to deplete the squad, where the Overwatch isn't actually going to wipe you out if you try and charge them and isn't quite as much of a death sentence. Another option, if you just want to have the enemy squad in combat, though you don't really care too much about the damage, that could be to charge one unit nearby to the enemy squad, and then use the pile-ins and consolidates to actually tag them in combat, hopefully locking up their powerful guns, and not giving them any opportunity to use them on you in your own turn. It is really quite surprisingly easy to achieve if you string out one of your own units, as you can just move closest to the nearest enemy model, and that might be the nearest model in another squad. Otherwise, you could maybe think about using an expendable unit to soak up the Overwatch fire. Say if you've got a unit of fragile melee damage dealers, you could maybe charge in with something like a dedicated transport, or something that's just so tough that they don't really care about the Overwatch fire. Things like Space Marine Rhinos are a great example of a really quite tough unit that's very cheap for the points, and doesn't really have the biggest worth of preserving once it's already done its job of transporting the troops into the fight. Otherwise, you could just maybe charge the squad with a really tiny depleted unit or something, maybe just a single model, something that they won't really want to spend the command point on to delete, and then if that model makes contact with the squad, they won't be able to overwatch the unit that they actually want to. Another good but slightly situational one is to hide behind terrain when you make your charge. Say infantry could hide behind breachable ruins and then just charge straight through it. You don't need to have line of sight to be able to make a charge, and fly units could use basically any piece of terrain that can block line of sight, and then just use the fly rule to hop straight over it. A gamey way of denying Overwatch could be to use the bodyguard rules to protect Overwatch from a charging character. I feel like this is more of a flaw in Games Workshop's rules writing than anything else, but things like Celestian Sacrosants or Space Marine Company veterans, they prevent any shooting whatsoever at characters nearby, and they don't make any sort of exception for Overwatch with that. It means that, say, if you had a Space Marine captain that was standing next to some company veterans and he makes a charge on the unit, then that unit can't actually overwatch him, as the bodyguard rule protects him. Just another example of why that rule's a little bit poorly written in my opinion. Plenty of datasheets do have options for denying Overwatch in the various codexes. Not every single army has them, but sometimes it could be genuinely quite important, again particularly for armies who have fragile and hard-hitting melee troops. Space Marines could use suppressors to deny Overwatch, Eldar Howling Banshees have it innately, the Drakari Cult of Strife has one, there's the Gloaming Bloat from Death Guard, Whirlwind Suppression Fire from Space Marines, and many psychic powers and other options. I must admit, as abilities go, I think it's useful to have in an army, but I'm not sure it's anywhere near as mandatory as it might have been in 8th, when basically every shooting unit was overwatching all the time. It was really quite nice to be able to turn that off so you just don't get some bad luck. But now Overwatch is a bit more niche, it makes these choices a bit nicher than they would be previously. I'd say they're maybe a bit more of a nice to have in an army list, rather than a must have. Finally though, even though there are quite a lot of good ways to prevent Overwatch, sometimes it's just really not worth bothering with. I would bear in mind that sometimes it is just going to be best just to make the charge and accept some losses, rather than trying to do anything gamey. Say for example, if you made your fairly tough squad charge from behind terrain to stop any Overwatch casualties, then their charge might well be a fair bit longer than if you just put them as close as possible, and you might feel a bit on the silly side if they then fail their charge because you've put them a lot further away. Often it's going to be relatively easy to assess how much damage your squad should be taking from Overwatch. 1 out of every 6 enemy shots should make it on average, though of course you could roll high or low with that. Overall though, Overwatch is quite an interesting part of 40k. I think it's still a good thing that it exists. It does have a good cinematic feel to it in game, but between being stratagem locked and having really quite a lot of counters to it, it's just perhaps not a sort of thing that you can build an entire army game plan around. more of a nice to have than something that you can truly rely on to stop your forces getting engaged in combat. As always, let me know what you think down in the comments below, particularly if there's any sort of tricks or tactics I've missed. I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description below. Making all the videos does take a fair amount of time, and if you are enjoying regularly, then any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain new videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.